My name is Rachel, and I'm 38 years old. The day I found out I was inheriting my late aunt's beach house was the same day I started losing my marriage. I just didn't know it yet. What I do know now is that an innocent question from a 7-year-old girl saved me from the worst mistake of my life, and that the person who helped me fight back was the last person I ever expected. Let me back up a little. I grew up in a small town in coastal Georgia. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody and Sunday dinners run 3 hours long. My parents divorced when I was 12, and my dad's side of the family sort of faded out of our lives after that. But my mom's sister, my Aunt Rita, she never let that happen with us. She drove 4 hours every Christmas to sit at our cramped kitchen table, and when my mom got sick my junior year of high school, Aunt Rita was the one who moved in for 6 weeks and made sure I got to school every morning. We were close in a way that didn't need a lot of words. She'd send me a card on random Tuesdays, just to say she was thinking of me. I still have a stack of them in a shoebox under my bed. Aunt Rita never had children of her own. She was married once, briefly, in her 30s, but it didn't last and she didn't seem to mourn it. Instead, she poured everything she had into her little cottage on street Simon's Island, fixed it up room by room over 20 years. Planted a garden in the backyard, hung wind chimes on every porch she could find. That cottage was her whole heart. She also had a savings account she'd been quietly feeding for decades, living modestly and putting away whatever she could. When she passed 2 years ago from a stroke, I was devastated. The grief was the kind that sits in your chest like a stone for months. I barely functioned at work. I cried at the grocery store twice. She was 71, healthy and sharp right up until she wasn't, and the quickness of it felt like a betrayal. Then her attorney called me. Aunt Rita had left me everything, the cottage on street Simon's, which was paid off and appraised at just over $300,000, and a savings account with $115,000 in it. She had left smaller amounts to a few local charities she loved. But the house and the bulk of her savings? All to me. I sat in that attorney's office and cried for a completely different reason than I had been crying for the past 2 months. My husband, Daniel, was thrilled when I told him. He hugged me and said he was so sorry about Aunt Rita, and that she must have loved me very much, and that we needed to protect the asset carefully. That last part, I remember thinking, was a little strange. Protect the asset. He said it like we were in a board meeting. But I let it go. Daniel was a practical man. That was one of the things I had always liked about him. We had been married for 6 years. I met him at a work conference in Atlanta. He was in commercial real estate. I was in corporate communications, and we sat next to each other at a dinner that neither of us wanted to attend. We talked for 3 hours. He was funny and confident, and he asked questions and actually listened to the answers. I was 31 and I thought, finally this is what it's supposed to feel like. We dated for 2 years, got engaged, had a small wedding in Savannah with close friends and family. His mother flew in from Charlotte. That was the first time I met my mother-in-law, and I spent the entire rehearsal dinner trying to figure out if she actually disliked me or if she was just one of those people who seemed like they disliked everyone. She was a tall, polished woman in her late 60s who spoke in a voice that always sounded like she was correcting you, even when she was saying something perfectly pleasant. By the end of the weekend I had concluded, it was specifically me. My mother-in-law never said anything outright cruel. She was too careful for that. But she had a way of sliding little comments into conversation that landed like paper cuts. She'd tell me I looked tired in the same tone other people used to say I looked lovely. She'd ask about my career and then tilt her head slightly when I answered, as if my answer had confirmed something disappointing. Daniel always brushed it off when I brought it up. He'd say she was just old-fashioned, that she was like that with everyone, that I was reading into things. I got better at ignoring it. I didn't get better at trusting her. My brother-in-law was a different story entirely. He was 8 years younger than Daniel, easygoing and genuine in a way that made you feel immediately comfortable. He lived in Nashville and worked as a high school basketball coach, and whenever he visited us he would do the dishes without being asked and ask me real questions about my life. I liked him a lot. I often thought he and Daniel must have had different fathers. They were so unlike each other, but that was unkind and I kept it to myself. The year after Aunt Rita passed, things between Daniel and me began to shift. It was subtle at first. He started having longer phone calls in the other room. He got quieter at dinner. He started making comments about the cottage. Shouldn't we be doing something with it? Weren't we just wasting an asset by leaving it empty? Had I thought about putting both our names on the deed? I told him I wanted to keep it exactly as it was for a while, that it was still too soon, that I wasn't ready to make decisions about it. He backed off, but something in his face didn't back off with him. Then my mother-in-law started calling me directly. This was unusual. In 6 years she had called me directly maybe 4 times, and 3 of those were to ask for Daniel's number when she couldn't reach him. Now she was calling to check in, to chat, to ask how I was processing my grief. It felt performative in a way I couldn't quite articulate, and it made me uneasy in a way I couldn't quite justify. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that people could surprise you. I had a neighbor down the street named Claire who worked long hours and whose daughter, Sophie, was 7 years old and obsessed with my garden. Sophie had started ringing my doorbell after school on days when her after-school program ended early and her mom was still at work, and somewhere along the way it had become an arrangement I'd watch Sophie for an hour or 2 until Claire could get home, and Sophie would help me water the tomatoes and report to me very seriously about everything that had happened at 2nd grade that day. I loved those afternoons. Sophie was the kind of kid who said exactly what she thought and had no idea how funny she was. One Tuesday in October, Sophie came over as usual, ate a snack at my kitchen counter, and then looked at me with that particular expression kids have when they're about to say something that seems completely obvious to them. "Are you going on a long trip?" she asked. "A long trip?" I repeated. "No, I'm not." "Why would you think that?" Sophie shrugged and bit into her apple. "My mom was on the phone last night and I heard her say that you probably won't be here much longer. That you'd be leaving soon." I set down the glass of water I was holding. "Did you hear anything else?" I asked, keeping my voice as normal as I could. "She said something about your house." Sophie thought about it for a second, kicking her feet under the bar stool. "That somebody was going to get your house." "Sophie, do you remember who your mom was talking to?" "I don't know. She was talking for a long time though. I tried to watch TV but she kept being loud." I hugged Sophie and we went out to water the garden and I pretended to be completely fine. But my hands were shaking a little by the time I turned on the hose. Claire had never been unfriendly to me, but we weren't close. We waved from driveways, exchanged Christmas cards. That was the extent of it. The idea that she knew something about my future before I did made my stomach drop in a way that was hard to explain. I spent that evening trying to reason myself out of what I was feeling. Claire could have been talking about anything. Kids mishear things all the time. Sophie had probably just caught a fragment of a completely unrelated conversation. I almost convinced myself. Then I thought about Daniel's questions about the deed. About my mother-in-law's sudden warmth. About the way Daniel had been sleeping with his phone face down on the nightstand for the past 2 months. I called my brother-in-law that night. I almost didn't. I thought about it for an hour, sitting in the car in the driveway because I didn't want Daniel to overhear, talking myself into it and back out of it. My brother-in-law was Daniel's family. He could tell Daniel everything I said. He could be part of whatever was happening, for all I knew. But I trusted him. In 6 years, my gut had never been wrong about him. And right now, my gut was the only thing I had. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Rachel, what's up? I need to ask you something," I said. "And I need you to be honest with me, even if it's uncomfortable. Can you do that?" A pause. "Yeah, of course. What's going on?" I told him everything. The questions about the deed. My mother-in-law's phone calls. What Sophie had said. The phone face down on the nightstand. I laid it all out and then I went quiet and waited. The silence on his end lasted long enough that I started to feel sick. "Caleb," I said. "Please." He exhaled. "Okay." I wasn't sure if any of this was real. I heard something a few weeks ago when I was visiting Mom and I told myself I misheard it, but I didn't. "What did you hear?" I was coming downstairs and I stopped because I heard Daniel's name and I probably should have kept walking, but I didn't. Mom was telling him that he needed to get his name on the deed before he filed. That he should use the inheritance as leverage in the settlement. She said something about the cottage being worth more than the savings and that if he moved fast he could claim it was a marital asset. I pressed my hand against my mouth. "Rachel, I am so sorry." I convinced myself that maybe I had misunderstood the context, that maybe they were talking about something else. "I should have called you." "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," I said. You're calling me now. That's what matters. What do you want to do? I stared out the windshield at my own front door. I want to make sure that whatever they're planning doesn't work. Can you help me? Tell me what you need, he said. The next morning I called in sick to work and sat down with a legal pad and went through everything carefully and methodically. I knew from Aunt Rita's attorney that the cottage was titled solely in my name and had been left to me specifically, not to Daniel and me jointly. Daniel had been pushing to add his name to the deed, but I had never agreed to it. That meant legally he had no claim on it unless he could argue it had been converted into a marital asset, which would be harder without his name on the title. The savings account was also in my name alone, kept in a separate account I had opened specifically because I'd read that inherited money could get complicated in a divorce if it was commingled with joint accounts. I had been careful without knowing I needed to be. But if Daniel was planning to file for divorce and make a claim, I needed to be more than careful. I needed to be a step ahead. Caleb had suggested I talk to a family law attorney, and I knew that was the right call. But I also knew something about how this world worked, and I had a feeling Daniel and my mother-in-law hadn't thought far enough ahead to do what I was about to do. I spent 3 hours that morning calling every highly rated family law attorney in the Charlotte metro area. I explained my situation briefly to each firm's intake coordinator, just enough to establish that I had consulted with them. Conflict of interest rules meant that once an attorney had heard the basics of a potential case from one party, they generally couldn't represent the opposing party in that same case. By noon, I had spoken to 6 firms, including the one my mother-in-law had used for her own divorce 20 years ago, which I knew about because she had mentioned it once at Thanksgiving with a kind of triumphant pride that I had filed away for no particular reason until now. I found my own attorney that afternoon. She was sharp, direct, and she listened to everything I told her without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You've done more right than most people who come in here having been blindsided." She told me that my inherited property was well protected based on how it was titled and the fact that I had kept the finances separate. She said the next question was whether Daniel would try to claim he had contributed to the property's value improvements, maintenance, that kind of thing, and she asked me to document everything that had been done to the cottage and who had paid for it. The answer to that was simple. Nothing had been done to the cottage since Aunt Rita left it to me. I had visited it twice, cried both times, and locked it back up. Daniel had never once offered to help with it and hadn't expressed any interest in it until there was money involved. My attorney and I also discussed what Caleb had overheard. She said it was useful context, but that we'd need something more concrete to establish intent. That's when I told her about Daniel's increasing pressure to get his name on the deed and that just 2 days earlier he had brought it up again, this time saying he'd found a notary who could come to the house over the weekend to make it simple and quick. "He's getting impatient," she said. "He thinks I'm going to say yes this time," I said. "Then let him think that." We put together a plan that was clean and careful. I told Daniel that I had thought it over and I was ready to talk about the deed, that I understood his concerns about us being protected as a couple. I watched something shift in his face when I said it, relief, but also something a little too eager, a little too quick. He kissed me on the forehead and said we'd work it out together. I smiled and said I knew we would. Over the following week, I did 3 things. First, I had Caleb agree to be available and reachable by phone on the Saturday that Daniel had arranged for the notary to come over. Second, I quietly moved the savings account funds to a new account that Daniel had no knowledge of, on advice from my attorney. Since the original account number had been mentioned in some household paperwork, Daniel could access. Third, I set up a small discreet camera in the home office where our important documents were kept, including some paperwork related to the cottage, using one of those devices disguised as a phone charger. Daniel knew I was paranoid about home security in general. He had no reason to look twice at it. On Friday night, I told Daniel I had to drive to St. Simon's early Saturday morning to meet with a property manager I was considering for the cottage, that I was thinking about renting it out seasonally and needed to see her in person. Daniel seemed unconcerned. He said he'd hold down the fort and we could go over the deed paperwork when I got back that evening. I drove to a coffee shop 40 minutes away and sat there with my laptop and my phone, waiting. Caleb called me at 9:47 in the morning. "He's on the phone with Mom," Caleb said. He was at the house he'd driven in the night before, on the pretense of visiting Daniel, and Daniel had been happy to have him stay. "He doesn't know I can hear him," He just told her the notary isn't coming until this afternoon but that he found the deed paperwork in the office. Rachel, he's talking about scanning it and sending it somewhere. I think he's trying to. Stay calm, I said. Don't let him know you heard anything. I'm calling my attorney right now. I called my attorney. She called the non-emergency line for the county sheriff's office and requested a welfare check, a legal mechanism that would get an officer to my home without alerting Daniel to what was actually happening. She also called her own contact at the recorder's office to flag any deed changes associated with my property as requiring additional verification. Then I drove home. When I walked through the door at just after noon, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table looking comfortable and unsurprised. Caleb was in the living room pretending to watch television. You're back early, Daniel said. The property manager canceled, I said. I set my bag down and sat across from him. So I thought we could talk now. He smiled. Perfect. Actually, I was thinking I found the deed paperwork in the office, so we could just go over it while we wait for the notary. I said. Can I ask you something first? Sure. Where were you planning to live after the divorce? The smile went very still on his face. I've known for a while, Daniel, I said. I want to hear you say it. I don't know what you're talking about. You've been talking to your mother about how to make a claim on Aunt Rita's cottage in the settlement. You pushed to get your name on the deed so you could argue it was a marital asset. You moved faster when I finally agreed because you were afraid I was going to figure it out. I kept my voice level. It was easier than I expected. What I want to understand is how long you've been planning this. He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back and let his face settle into something harder than anything I had ever seen on him before. You don't have anything, he said. You have some speculation and a feeling. I have a recording, I said, of you in the home office this morning talking to your mother about the deed. I have phone records I've subpoenaed through my attorney. I have Caleb, who heard your mother tell you to file before getting your name on the title. Daniel looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him without expression. You, Daniel said. She called me first, Caleb said quietly. I should have called her sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. I've also already consulted with essentially every family law attorney in this city, I said. Which means your options for representation just got a lot more limited. I stood up. I filed for divorce this morning. You'll be served formally, but I wanted to tell you in person because we were married for 6 years and I think I at least deserve to look you in the face when I say that I know exactly what you are. The look on his face in that moment, the calculation, the frustration, the lack of any genuine remorse told me everything I needed to know about who I had been living with. Not once did he look sorry. Not once did he say my name with anything like tenderness. He just started talking about lawyers and assets and percentages, and I stopped listening because there was nothing left to hear. He was out of the house by the end of the following week. The months that came after were not easy. The legal process ground forward the way legal processes do, slowly and expensively, and with a lot of paperwork I had to read twice to understand. But my attorney was exactly as good as I had believed her to be, and the documentation I had was solid. The cottage stayed in my name. The savings stayed in my account. Daniel's claim that he had somehow contributed to either was dismissed with almost no debate once the records were examined. But there was a second thread to this story that I hadn't seen coming. During the discovery process, my attorney started pulling financial records that were relevant to claims Daniel was making about our joint finances. In doing so, she noticed some irregularities in a family trust that Daniel's father had established before he passed, a trust that was supposed to benefit both Daniel and Caleb equally. The trust was managed by my mother-in-law. Caleb hadn't known to look. He'd always trusted his mother's accounting of it, received the occasional distribution, and assumed everything was in order. It wasn't. My attorney flagged it to Caleb's attorney, who launched a separate investigation. What came out of that investigation took another 4 months to untangle. But the short version was this. My mother-in-law had been drawing from the trust for years in ways that weren't authorized, and Daniel had known about it and said nothing, possibly because she had been funneling some of those funds toward him on the side. The full scope of it was enough that both Daniel and my mother-in-law faced civil liability to Caleb, and my mother-in-law faced potential criminal charges for fiduciary fraud. Daniel's grand plan to walk away from our marriage with a beach house and over $100,000 in cash collapsed into something considerably less triumphant. He ended up owing his brother a significant settlement, paying legal fees on multiple fronts, and walking away from our marriage with his car, his clothes, and the lesson that not everything in life can be quietly maneuvered into your column. My mother-in-law, for her part, called me 3 times in the weeks after everything became public. The first 2 calls I let go to voicemail. The third one I answered, because I was curious. "You destroyed this family," she said. Her voice was different from how it had ever been with me before. The polished corrective tone was gone, replaced with something raw and genuine that almost made me feel something. "I didn't destroy anything," I said. "I just stopped letting it be destroyed quietly." She didn't have an answer for that. We said goodbye, and I haven't heard from her since. Caleb and I talk every couple of weeks now. He came down to St. Simon's with me in the spring to finally open the cottage properly, clean out the dust, air out the rooms, start getting it ready to actually be used and loved again. We drank coffee on the porch in the morning and watched the water, and he told me about a woman he'd been seeing in Nashville, and I told him that Aunt Rita would have adored him. "I should have called you sooner," he said, "not for the first time." "You called me when it mattered," I said. "The garden at my house is coming in beautifully this year. Sophie still comes over after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and she has graduated from watering tomatoes to having strong and extensively researched opinions about which herbs belong in which part of the bed." Her mother, Claire, it turned out, had overheard Daniel on the phone in our shared driveway one evening and had mentioned to a mutual acquaintance that it sounded like we were having problems. Sophie had misunderstood the fragment, as children do, and had delivered it to me in her completely unfiltered 7-year-old way. She has no idea she handed me the first thread of what unraveled everything. Sometimes I think about Aunt Rita and what she would make of all this. I think she would be furious on my behalf and also quietly pleased that the cottage is still standing exactly as she left it, that I am taking care of it the way she took care of me. I am planning to spend August there this year. I'm going to sit on her porch with her wind chimes and watch the water, and I'm going to be grateful in a way that has nothing to do with real estate or inheritance or any of it. Just grateful. For the cottage, and for the women who loved it before me, and for the fact that a little girl asked me a question about a trip I was never planning to take. My name is Rachel, I'm 38 years old, and I am doing more than fine.